NFL star Steve McNair was born in Mississippi on February 14, 1973, to a single mother, and he was one of 5 sons. As a teenager, he showed up and showed out as an outstanding athlete as he took part in several sports such as baseball, football, basketball, and track. Although he was very much talented in all the above, he specifically excelled on the football field. His academics were just as sharp as his athleticism as he graduated from high school and went on to attend Alcorn State University. Here is where he took the role as the university's quarterback. After leading such a successful college career, Steve, who was affectionately nicknamed Air McNair, went on to be the 3rd overall pick in the 1995 NFL Draft, signing a 7-year contract with the Houston Oilers. A couple years later, the team moved to Tennessee and became known as the Titans. Steve spent most of his NFL career with the team, appearing in the playoffs on 4 occasions and playing in the 2000 Super Bowl. The following year, he signed a 6-year extension with the Titans for $47 million. In 2003, he had the best season of his career and was named one of the NFL's MVPs. After several injuries and contract negotiations, Steve was traded to the Baltimore Ravens as their new starting quarterback. He played his final 2 seasons in the NFL with them and officially announced his retirement in April of 2008. Now, in the midst of all these achievements, Steve created life with a couple different women, welcoming 2 sons into the world before he got married to his beloved wife, a woman named Michelle, who he met at Alcorn State. And then they went on to have 2 sons of their own together, making Steve a dad to 4 sons. Although Steve retired back in 2008, it didn't mean he stopped working. Steve had other business ventures going on, such as some charity work. He would travel back and forth between Nashville and McNair Farms in Mississippi, where he was the president of a ranching and farming business. He also reopened the Nashville restaurant, Gridiron 9, so he could help students have affordable meals. In addition to all that, Steve created the Steve McNair Foundation to help serve underprivileged children through educational and athletic programs. The nonprofit helped raise money for other local charitable organizations through hosting different events, and he also hosted 3 youth football camps every year for aspiring young athletes. Now, with all these amazing things being said about Mr. McNair, I unfortunately have to get into the gritty side of his lifestyle, as he did live a double life outside of the family that he created with his wife, Michelle. You see, not long after retiring from the NFL, 35-year-old Steve went on to have an extramarital affair with a girl much younger than him. 19 years old at the time, Sahel Kazemi was his mistress. The 2 met at a Dave & Buster's in Nashville, which was the place of employment for Sahel, where she worked as a waitress, and Dave & Buster's was reportedly a spot that football players loved to frequent at that time, so that's how they met. Now, according to reports from the Tennessean publication, Sahel actually grew up in Iran. She wasn't from America. She grew up in Iran as a little girl, but unfortunately, she lost her mother at the very young age of 9 years old. So she then moved to the States at the age of 13 and had been leaning further into her independence since. So when she met Steve, it was like a breath of fresh air. You see, according to Sahel's roommate, a young lady named Emily Andrews, she spoke to Steve and Sahel's relationship and stated how she watched the 2 grow in love with each other. She spoke about how they genuinely loved and cared for each other, and they would even have conversations about adopting children one day and building this beautiful life together. She said they also had allegedly been looking at houses together, even though Steve was still living with his wife and children. Now, allegedly, Steve didn't hide his affair with Sahel from his wife. And it's also alleged that Steve and Sahel were going on trips and vacations together. They would go to hot spots like Vegas and Florida, and it's reported that he even took her to his farm back in Mississippi. And it's also alleged that they introduced each other to one another's families. Sahel also allegedly told her friends and family that Steve used some of the oldest game a married man uses with his mistress, and that's telling her that he was going to divorce his wife, leave his family so he could go off into the sunset and marry her so they could live happily ever after, blah, blah, blah. And Steve made it easy for Sahel to fall for his words, as he made an even more thoughtful gesture by gifting her and co-signing on a black Cadillac Escalade for Sahel's 20th birthday in May 2009. And when her family came to Nashville to spend her 20th birthday with her, they were able to meet Steve, and they all went out for sushi dinner and partied at the clubs around town, according to the reports. So now here Sahel is, young girl who just barely made it out of her teens, dealing with this older man that's telling her all the sweet nothings. I'm gonna leave my wife, me and you, we gonna go on and adopt our kids and live happily ever after. Meeting her friends and family, buying her gifts, giving her money. She's smitten with this man. This is a prestigious man, retired from the NFL with these respected stats, owns multiple businesses. He got a farm, he do charity, and he gassing her up. You know what I'm saying? Telling her all of these things. So she feeling like outside of his wife, she's the only one who got his heart. Well, that is until one day, Sahel's chest caved into her upper back when she saw a whole other woman leaving Steve's condo. Sahel wasn't having it. She called her quote-unquote man immediately and asked him about it. Of course, you already know he gassed her up again. You know how that go. Nah, you bugging. You the only one for me. You the only one I want. You ain't got nothing to worry about, babe. Sound good, right? Until the day of July 1st, 2009, when Sahel reportedly told a friend of hers that she found used condoms in Steve's condo that she would spend time with him at. So at this point, Sahel already knew what it was, but nonetheless, she wasn't ready to leave him alone just yet. In fact, later that same evening of finding the used condoms, Sahel still wanted to be next to him, so she linked up with Steve and they headed out to a sports bar together, where they eventually were joined by one of Steve's friends, a man named Vince Gordon. After some hours of chilling, the three of them decided, all right, it's time to go. So they leave the bar and they start heading home. As they were on their way home in the early hours of the morning on July 2nd, Sahel was pulled over by police due to her driving recklessly and was asked to do a breath test, but she refused to do it. So she got arrested on DUI charges, while Steve and his mans was allowed to leave the scene in a cab. So Steve did arrange for her bail and got her out, but he didn't go to pick her up, and Sahel was heated about that. She expressed herself and they got into a real bad argument over it. But the next day on July 3rd, Sahel texted Steve several lengthy messages while he was out fishing with his sons. She was venting to him, I guess maybe looking for sympathy or just needed somebody to talk to, but she was telling him that she was having panic attacks and feeling anxious because she was under so much stress. Apparently, she had debt piling up to her neck. She told him that she had her cell phone bill to pay. She had hospital bills to pay. Plus, her roommate had moved out, which doubled her rent up to almost $1,000 that she would have had to pay on her own with her Dave & Buster's check. And back then, the minimum wage at that time was $7.25 an hour, and that's what Dave & Buster's was paying. Plus, the car payments on the Escalade, and yes, she was funding the payments of the Escalade on her own. Apparently, she told her friend she wanted to maintain some level of independence, so that's why she was making her own payments for the Escalade. So during this conversation of Sahel airing out her grievances and Steve's texts is when Steve agreed to transfer her $2,000 to assist with some of her costs. But Sahel was still pretty distraught and threw out the idea of going to the hospital to get herself checked out. So Steve told her, okay, if that's the case, keep me updated. Let me know if you need anything. And she ended up asking if she could meet up with him later that day at his condo, and he obliged. But what he didn't know was how grave of a mistake that was. After Steve agreed with Sahel pulling up on him, she got herself ready to go to work, but before headed into the establishment, she met up with a man named Adrian Gilliam in the parking lot of the Dave & Buster's. And so who's Adrian? Well, he's a convicted felon who Sahel met when she was trying to sell her older car to him some weeks prior. But this time they weren't meeting up about a car. They instead were meeting up because Sahel was purchasing a firearm from him. p.m., a 9mm handgun to be specific. Once she made her purchase, she headed into work, and her manager, a woman named Sonia noticed that Sahel wasn't acting like her usual upbeat self. So Sonia decided to check in with her, see how she was feeling. And Sahel must have felt really comfortable with her manager because she opened up to her about everything. She told her about her relationship with Steve, the stress of her financial woes, and the DUI that she acquired. But what was strange was Sonia said at the time, even though Sahel was explaining all that she was going through, she didn't seem to be the least bit bothered by it. Sahel didn't seem to be stressed out, even though she was listing stress factors. But then Sahel made a very alarming statement when she ended the conversation with her manager by saying, quote, "My life is just shit and I should end it," end quote. And saying this while still showing no emotion. So once Sahel finished her shift, she texted Steve to ask him if he wanted to go grab some drinks with her. He said no because he was busy on daddy duty, but he ended up going out with his mans anyway. And while he was out, Sahel pulled up to Steve's condo. At approximately 12:40 a.m. on July 4th, Steve texted her to let her know that he was on his way back to the condo, and his driver dropped him off somewhere between 1:15 and 1:30 in the morning. Unfortunately, his driver would be the last known person to see Steve alive, because both Steve and Sahel was found deceased in his condo later that day. According to People.com, a man named Wayne Neely, who was Steve's friend and also the one who Steve rented the condo from, had come into the condo at approximately 12:40 p.m. For what reason did he enter the condo? Reports doesn't say, but Wayne came into the crib and he saw the two bodies laying in there. However, he went into a panic and he didn't even bother to go look and see who the bodies belonged to. He claimed to not have known who the bodies identified as, so he ran out of the condo, and at about 12:50 p.m., he called a man named Robert Gaddy. He didn't call 911 first, he called Robert Gaddy. Robert was not only a business partner, but also a close, longtime friend of Steve's, and Wayne told him what he saw. So Robert pulled up and they both re-entered the condo. Once inside the apartment, Robert immediately knew one of the bodies was his friend, 36-year-old Steve McNair. He stepped outside at approximately 1:35 p.m. and frantically called 911. He told police Steve was face down on a bloody couch, as well as blood on his sneakers and a gunshot wound to the head. 20-year-old Sahel was found next to him with the firearm in her hand underneath her and dots of blood on the walls. Investigators on the case believe the motive behind the crime could have been Sahel's financial issues and her trust issues with Steve, dealing with other women outside of her and his wife. Police believe that based on the evidence they collected after a night out having some drinks, Steve came in and was knocked out sleeping on the couch. And when Sahel walked up on him in his sleep, she shot him multiple times. They said she shot him on the left side of his head from a few feet away, and then twice in his chest, and another on the right side of his head at a closer range. Then they say she sat down next to Steve, held the firearm up to her head, shot herself in the right side of her head, and collapsed onto his lap, where she eventually fell onto the floor on top of the firearm. When the general public found out about this story, it was mayhem. Everybody was shocked. Everybody was talking about it. This is a well-known NFL player who had just retired right before his demise. He had been found killed, laying beside his mistress. So it was crazy. And although that in itself is pretty controversial, people still showed Steve nothing but respect when speaking on his memory. His former coach, Jeff Fisher, described Steve as someone who was pretty quiet, but he was approachable. He smiled a lot, and people just really liked him. He said Steve wasn't the type to be up all in the cameras or all up in the interviews. He had the talent to take him to the heights that he wanted to be. He didn't need to do anything extra. Now let's go further into some more details for more context of this whirlwind affair that ended tragically. It had been reported that Steve was dealing with Sahel for about 6 whole months before the murder-suicide. During that time, Sahel became more insecure, and for good reason, because outside of her literally playing number two and ignoring her intuition that was telling telling her that this man was not being completely honest with her, she had a feeling, and she had proof that she was not the only side chick. And that theory was confirmed, as it had been reported that he was dealing with a whole different young woman that he met several months before he even met Sahel. The young woman name is Leah Ignagne, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but I'll just say Leah for the rest of this explanation of this part of the story. You see, Leah had spoken to police and told them that she could remember several different occasions when she was being followed by a Cadillac Escalade. Of course, that being Sahel, and the realization that Sahel had been following her and, watching her moves to see what was up with her and Steve. And what's crazy is, remember I told you how Sahel got arrested for a DUI when she was with Steve and his mans in the Escalade after the bar? Well, Steve wasn't even supposed to be linking with Sahel that night. He only linked up with her because Leah declined hanging out with Steve that night. In fact, a little while after Steve and Sahel got into the argument about him bailing her out and not picking her up, he ended up going to see Leah that morning before heading into his restaurant to open it up for the day. And later that night, he slept over at Leah's place. So I do believe that Sahel was fully aware of another woman being involved, but can't speak to whether or not she knew exactly who it was. And in a way, I'm kind of glad it's possible that she didn't know who Leah was, because if she did, it would be quite possible that she would have tried to kill her too. And it also had been reported that a member of Steve's security, a man named Chris Wall, also provided a statement from his perspective, witnessing Steve and Sahel's relationship. And he said Steve had become more and more aggravated with Sahel over time because she would overstep her boundaries. She would call his phone all hours of the night while he would be sitting up with his wife and children. So at that point, he felt like he needed to distance himself from her and spend time with her less and less, which is crazy because he wouldn't even have to deal with that. There was no mistress involved to begin with. So now, although Sahel was so caught up on whatever Steve had going on outside of her, she's still preoccupied herself with an ex-boyfriend of her own. You see, Sahel had been dealing with her ex again within the months before the murder-suicide took place. He said he knew Sahel was stressed out because he had never seen her in that state of mind before, which is a contradiction of what other people had to say about Sahel's demeanor. Now, this ex-boyfriend is actually the one that she moved from Florida to Tennessee with when she was just 16 years old. But by December of 2008, after breaking up with him, is when Sahel moved on with Steve in the same month that she broke up with her ex. Now, those who knew Sahel said not only was she financially stressed, but she was extremely upset at the thought that Steve was dealing with other women outside of her and his wife. Her sister, Sapita Salmani, said that in the weeks before her death, Steve told Sahel that the divorce with his wife was being finalized. Now, there's a private investigator by the name of Vincent Hill who's very familiar with this case, and he presented a different perspective about this tragedy based on his professional expertise. And of course, when I run this down to you, feel free in the comments to say whether or not you agree. So Vincent actually doesn't believe that Sahel killed Steve or herself. He believes that Adrian is the perpetrator, the one that Sahel bought the firearm from. Vincent did his own investigations and said that police made a lot of mistakes. He stated that cell phone records between Sahel and Adrian showed that there had been over 200 phone calls back and forth between the two, with the most recent call being at 12:02 a.m. on July 4th. And apparently Adrian lied about his alibi, but I'm assuming he lied because he's a convicted felon and wasn't supposed to have a firearm in his possession. Vincent Hill tried to reopen the case again in 2010, but a grand jury found insufficient evidence to do so. Sahel's family and friends also raised questions about the manner of their death. They said they doubted that Sahel would have ever been capable of doing such a brutal killing, considering she had never even used a gun before. They also said Sahel never gave the energy of being under distress or ever even complained about any financial struggles or any struggles in general, nor did they say she appeared to be suicidal. Of course, none of that means she wasn't struggling. We've heard too many times about highly functioning folks that appeared to be okay on the outside and even would hide their sorrows from a certain group of people while opening up about it with others. So the mention of her not seeming stressed to some folks doesn't really move me. And there have been questions and speculation about Steve's wife and his friends. They questioned the rocky relationship between Steve and his wife, insinuating, maybe she knew about the affair and wanted to get revenge. They also questioned question his friends and why it took a whole hour before they called 911, insinuating that maybe they had something to do with it. And of course, Adrian, as I just mentioned a moment ago, people feel like he may have had something to do with it because he probably had a romantic interest in Sahel. And that may have been the motive behind him possibly, hurting somebody, especially with him being an ex-con, although it isn't clear what he was locked up for previously. So in December 2009, Adrian was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for possessing a firearm as a felon. Obviously, by now, 2024, he's definitely a free man. As for Steve's wife, Michelle, it's reported that she had never had any plans to divorce her husband and had no idea that Steve was even having an affair with Sahel. She said, quote, "I don't know about her at all. People will say, oh, she knew. Did I know about some other people and some other things? Yes. But did I know about her? No, I did not." Thousands of people showed up to Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Whites Creek, Tennessee on July 9th for Steve's memorial service, which included his wife and children, of course, former teammates, family members, friends, and fans from all walks of life. His funeral was held a couple days later on July 11th, 2009 in his home state of Mississippi. As I was researching this story, I came to realize that there's a documentary about it on Netflix, and Steve's family was reportedly involved heavy into the making of that documentary. So I would imagine that there's like loads of details over there. I believe it came out this summer. I didn't know about the documentary before me doing my own research, and I still haven't watched it. But if you haven't already, I would say go watch it yourself and see if maybe there's some extra information on there that I didn't capture here in my video, if you're even, interested in doing that. I find it so eerie that people like Sahel's manager, Sonia, and others said that they didn't see Sahel stressed out. And for Sonia, she said although Sahel was listing her stress factors and made that remark about her ending her life, she didn't seem to be upset or stressed at all. So it makes me wonder if maybe Sahel didn't appear to be so stressed because she was already at peace. You ever hear about those stories where a person who would usually be down or up and down suddenly would have this melancholy demeanor, like very calm and just kind of floating, or even a burst of happiness like out of nowhere just before they ended their own lives because they've come to peace with the decision that they made? I wonder if that's what was going on here with Sahel. Like maybe she already knew she was going to take both of their lives, planned it out in her head and made peace with it. I don't know, something, but I was just thinking about that as I was doing the research here. Well, familia, this is really another tragic story about the consequences of your actions when you play in people's faces and live a lifestyle of lies, deceit, and no integrity. Michelle said she had no idea about Steve and Sahel's affair, which tells me he lied to his wife about her. Sahel foolishly felt like she was the only one outside of his wife, but clearly he was lying to her too. All these poor decisions led to a catastrophic end. And I hate that it happened this way because both Steve and Sahel were still so very young. And Sahel suffered from an extreme amount of abandonment trauma. And of course, it was a result of, her mom passing away while she was still so young. So the thought of losing her quote unquote man to anyone else outside of her and his wife seems to have been too much for Sahel to bear. This story is extremely unfortunate, familia, but I'm going to give you the floor. I want you to tell me what you think about this roller coaster of a ride with this story. How did it make you feel? Do you see where Steve went wrong, or do you feel like this story is entirely Sahel's fault? And what do you think about the conspiracies surrounding their deaths? You know how we do, familia. We're going to chop it up below. I want to send my deepest condolences to Steve's children, his wife, his friends, family, all his loved ones. And I also send my condolences to the family of Sahel. May your spirit live on with your loved ones forever, Steve. You'll never be forgotten.